Let me make some quick announcements before we begin. Hi, everybody. My name is Hadar Harris. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Human Rights Humanitarian Law, but pretty much all of you know that already. It is good to see you here. There were many competing events that we suddenly found out were taking place when we looked in the elevator this week. So you are a small but mighty group, and we are very glad that you're here. And you actually will have the treat, because this is going to be a conversation that isn't taking place in other places in the law school, and is one that we haven't had enough in this building. And so we're thrilled that Theresa Harris, one of our esteemed alumni, a former member of the Center Student Advisory Board, and our good friend, reached out to us at the beginning of the summer, the last spring, something like that, to collaborate more closely on a series of different kinds of events. And this is the first of what we hope will be several. And so I'm going to leave it to Theresa to introduce the panel in just a moment. But before that, because Theresa knows I would use the captive audience to make announcements about other upcoming events. On Friday, we are still scheduled. We plan to take a visit down to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. If you have not been and you can join us, please let us know. It's an important way that we start the school year by taking our students who are interested in the study of human rights or law generally to that museum to meet with the survivor and to tour the permanent exhibit. It's a very powerful and very important way for us to start off the year and to start everybody's kind of study and examination of issues of human rights. And so if you can join us, we would very much like you to come. There may be another date being circulated at the moment because we know that there is a conflict that has recently arisen with 1L seminars on Friday afternoon, and so stay tuned to hear about that. And if you can't go but you're interested in the alternative date, let me know. The other thing is, starting in 2 weeks, we have our 15th annual Human Rights Film Series with a series of 4 films that will be screened free and open to everyone in the public. So bring everybody you know from the public. And all of you can bring your neighbors, your friends, the person you sit next to on the metro, to the screening of 4 really extraordinary films that will take place in the new theater in the new School of Communications building on the main campus. So it's a double whammy. You get to learn where things are on the main campus, which we like to promote over here, and also see these 4 great films. The first one is a film called E.T. It's on Wednesday, October 1st. These are for the first 4 Wednesdays in October at 7 p.m. And it is a great new film about the emergency response team at Human Rights Watch and their work. And so very much encourage you to come to these 4 films dealing with different parts of the world, different kinds of human rights issues. And again, free and open to the public. You can grab a postcard here on the table. That's all that I am going to say. But again, I do very much want to thank Theresa. I want to thank Lauren Bartlett and McBain from the center. And hand it over to you.
Thank you. Turn this on? There we go. Hi, and thank you to Hadar and to Lauren for organizing this and ordering the pizza. Yay. So I wanted to ask, when you saw the title, so is everybody here law students? Do we have anybody from the main campus here? No? Everybody's law students? Yes? Pretty much? Okay. Do any of you have a background in science or a social science or physical science? That's what you majored in college, or any one person?
There's not one.
Another one? Great. Anybody here who is absolutely terrified, and that's the whole reason you went to law school? Right? So, not raising your hand really high. So, well, that's what we're going to talk about is how to partner with scientists and give you some examples of some of the ways that scientists, and when we use that term, we use it very broadly. We're talking about social sciences, mathematics, engineering, physical sciences, life sciences, health professions. We use that to cover everything that falls under that umbrella. Because there's a lot of ways now that people who work in this field are partnering with human rights practitioners to support human rights, to gather the evidence that's needed as part of documentation, monitoring, litigation, other human rights tactics. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to give you some examples to spark some ideas, see some ways that this is happening now, and hopefully the next step after that will be to participate in some workshops where we've been talking about that maybe go a step further, help develop expertise in particular areas so that you're a smart consumer of these kinds of this kind of expertise, this kind of information, and can effectively partner with scientists and engineers moving forward. I'm going to use the PowerPoint. Oh, can I use this? Could I? This works.
That's just.
Oh, it's just. Excellent. So mine is the one that says 917. That's mine. Yeah. Great. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction. There we go. I'm going to give an introduction, and should we switch seats?
Yeah, sure.
Musical chairs. Give an introduction and overview of the connections between science and human rights. A few examples of what we've been doing at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS. And then I'm going to introduce Jonathan Drake and Mary Gray, who are going to talk about their own experiences in this area. We'll be able to take some questions in between, but we want to try to make sure to get all the information out there as much as possible. We'll have lots of time at the end for discussion and Q&A, especially since this is a little bit smaller group. But if there is a question that comes up, feel free to ask at the end of the presentations, and I'll leave it to the speakers to maybe make their own decisions about whether to change that. So I work at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, as does Jonathan, which is the world's largest multidisciplinary scientific membership organization. It's based here in Washington, D.C. We are best known for publishing the journal Science. You might have heard of that. So it turns up in, before I started working at AAAS, my familiarity with it was you would always hear these headlines. This week published in the journal Science was this amazing new discovery. That's us. We publish science. So what is human rights doing at a scientific organization? The AAAS has a number of programmatic areas, programs with different projects in education, science policy. One of those is the Scientific Responsibility, Human Rights and Law program. We are promoting high standards for the practice of science, advancing the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress, which I'll talk a little bit more about that later, engaging scientists in human rights, furthering the use of science and technology in support of human rights, and enhancing assessment of ethical, legal, and human rights issues related to science and technology. Not everything we do is specifically connected to human rights. Some of it is things like training for judges in the use of neuroscience in the courts, issues that are more directly connected to science and law or science ethics, but a lot of what we do is human rights. For example, we have a program called the AAAS Science and Human Rights Coalition. This is a network of scientific societies that recognize a role for science and engineering in human rights. So groups like those on the slide, the American Political Science Association, the American Chemical Society, American Psychological Association, American Physical Society, these are all members of the coalition, which meets at AAAS here in Washington, D.C. twice a year, every January and July. Those meetings are open to the public. They are usually on a human rights theme, talking about how that connects to human rights. The next meeting in January is going to be on big data in human rights. So if that's something you're interested in, please watch for the announcements, and you're very welcome to come. We often have very prominent human rights practitioners and leading thinkers speak at the coalition events. This is just a few people. You might recognize Mary Robinson, Michael Posner, Frank LaRue, Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression. And within the coalition, there are 5 areas of activity which align to a certain extent with the 5 ways that we see science connecting with human rights. These are different working groups. This particular event today was co-organized with the Service to the Human Rights Community Working Group. This is a group that's dedicated to reaching out to the human rights community to make them more aware of the opportunities that are available to partner with scientists and engineers. So just to go through very quickly, the connections, the welfare of scientists. Scientists have human rights, and scientists are often persecuted, particularly because of the work that they're doing. It could be that they're researching. I'll give you a particular example. Just very recently, there was a political scientist, sociologist, who was interviewing people in Tajikistan and asking them questions that the government did not find appropriate, and he was charged with treason, if I remember correctly, and was imprisoned, and he has been now released, but was basically imprisoned specifically because of the research he was doing, talking with people, doing surveys in that country. There's a physicist right now who's been in prison for quite some time. In Iran. He is a student at the University of Texas and a PhD student, and when he went back to Iran, he was challenged for or the government asked him to conduct research there in Iran, and he refused to do it. He has been charged with accepting foreign money, funding from a foreign source, which is basically his student stipend at the University of Texas, and he's still in prison in Iran. And the American Physical Society, a number of scientific societies have taken up his case, trying to get him out. Ethics and human rights, there's obviously a lot of connections with scientific ethics, scientific responsibility, for example, human subject protections, issues like informed consent, privacy. These are all human rights concerns, and there are a lot of crossovers there. And one of the things that we try to do is help the scientific community see where they have human rights responsibilities, but then also the flip of that. So, for example, when human rights researchers are interviewing people in the field, what kinds of protections should they be using? What lessons could they learn from what the scientific community has learned about human subjects protections? Service to the STEM community. STEM is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. There is a working group that's developing materials for scientific associations to get more involved in human rights. Service to the human rights community, I already talked about. They also developed this document that's available on our website called Guidelines for Scientists and Human Rights Organizations. This is a great resource if you're partnering with a scientist for thinking about how to start the relationship and maybe develop a letter of agreement or an MOU on what the scope of work is going to be. There's a lot of guidelines in here that are really helpful for that kind of thing. And they also organize workshops like this. And education and information resources. So there's a working group that's developing human rights education modules for science and engineering students, trying to incorporate human rights education into those courses. And developing, for example, a list of syllabi that have been developed for by professors in these fields, also a list of an annotated bibliography for resources on these issues. And our Communication and Outreach Committee has developed 2 student competitions. We have a student poster competition and a student essay competition, which are open not just to science and engineering students, they are open to everyone. The undergraduate winner of the last student essay competition was a law student from India. So please consider entering competitions. And then all of these groups are working on Article 15, which is Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, includes the right of everyone to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications. We've been doing a lot of work to bring the voice of the scientific community to defining what exactly that means. What would it mean for everyone to enjoy? What are the benefits of scientific progress to society? What are the important ones in a human rights context? How does that connect to other rights? And this is We've put together a report on this, and my colleague Jessica Wyndham, who's in this picture, and Margaret Petula of the American Sociological Association have presented these findings to the UN in the early stages of this process of defining the right. This is continuing. There's a special rapporteur who's working on this. So I won't go in depth into that, but wanted to highlight it to you. Another project is On Call Scientists. This is modeled after a legal pro bono referral network, but scientists instead of lawyers. Human rights, specifically for human rights organizations, human rights practitioners can request assistance from a scientist in any field. We have 800 volunteers, 800 plus now, and we refer a specialist with that expertise to them. The volunteers are based in more than 40 countries. We've made more than 200 matches so far, and these are projects in the U.S. and around the world. A lot of the work can be done remotely. Some of it involves travel, but there's a wide array of things that the scientists are doing. Answering questions about evidence, about research methodology, providing specialized expertise in investigations, helping to design a survey, design a sampling method, oversee that, review, analyze results, reviewing documents. We have a lot of requests for environmental scientists to look at environmental impact assessments for groups that are concerned about potential impacts of a new infrastructure project, for example. That comes up all the time, and those are things that somebody doesn't have to travel to another country, or they can do that from their desk, write a report that then the attorneys or the advocates can refer to. Really quickly, a couple of examples of these projects, just to give you a taste for this. One example, Global Rights requested help assessing the impact of extractive industries in several countries in Africa. We referred a geochemist who you can see in this picture, and he trained the local community, the partners that were working with Global Rights, in the ways that they could set up a monitoring system for assessing the impact themselves and monitoring as it went on, instructed them in, explained how this worked, what they were looking at, what the results meant, and that meant that they could be doing this themselves, and he doesn't have to be there. And they were able to bring the findings themselves in the context of their own experience and other human rights impacts that they were seeing. They could bring that to policymakers and advocate for change. The psychologist was looking at the impact of working in the mines on children. And she designed that, again, working with the communities to design that research. The Environmental Defender Law Center has requested a number of experts from us. One was advising a team that was developing new environmental protection regulations in China related to hazardous materials and pollutant management. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have requested experts looking at the online videos that were uploaded alleging to document chemical weapons. Now, some of them do, some of them were actually videos of something else that was happening, and so there was a lot of work to find out which ones are authentic, and then if these are really coming from the site, what are they showing? What is this canister? What is this? What are the impacts, the physical health impacts of the people who are shown in this? Does this look like a reaction to chemical weapons? And the work that the volunteers did was cited in this Human Rights Watch report, was they were able to say very clearly what kind of weapons were probably being used, who would have access to that because of the help of these experts. And there's also the opportunity for direct services. We've had a number of requests from innocence projects around the country asking for, in this example, assistance with DNA evidence, but also things like reviewing evidence that was presented in an original trial, where now there's a claim of wrongful conviction and the defense attorney wasn't able to contest that during the trial. And so reviewing that to see whether the evidence holds up to current standards. We've had requests for all kinds of forensic scientists related to wrongful convictions. So this is another opportunity. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers. We have Professor Mary Gray, who is, let me on my paper, who is a professor up at main campus in the Department of Mathematics and Statistics. She has a PhD from the University of Kansas, and she also holds a JD from WCL here. So she knows both sides of this equation. She works on the application of statistics to human rights and civil rights. And in addition to statistics, her research includes the history of mathematics, in particular the role of women in the field. So I think, Mary, do you want to go first? And
Okay.
Then I'll introduce Jonathan after that.
So do you want to move the slides? Because I can
do that.
Okay.
That might
so
be the
put up the
easiest
first slide, if you would, please.
All right. Exit this show. Oop. Thanks.
Okay. This is a slide that I use in a class that I teach, which is called survey sampling. It's a course that's taken by a lot of people who want to go out and do surveys, either to try to determine who's going to win the next election, or whether hospital workers in Vietnam are being mistreated, or what have you. And the character in this is a 2006 cartoon. Unfortunately, it's still very relevant. The reporter in it is sort of Doonesbury's version of Fox News. So it's a completely incompetent reporter who is always doing stupid things. Well, in this particular one, this was another time in which there was a diaspora of Christian populations from Iraq. And the question is, how many people were there? So the person who's being interviewed says it's a diaspora, one of the largest in history. Might be as many as 600,000. And the reporter said, it might be only as many as 600. So what we show this for is to show people it's important to get the statistics. You don't just throw around numbers without going out and doing the survey and basing your facts on that. People often ask how I got interested in human rights. And it was because when I was more of a mathematician than a statistician, there was a mathematician who had been imprisoned in Uruguay for some time under after the military takeover of Uruguay and the dictatorial regime. And we had tried all sorts of things to get him out of prison, like writing letters and going to the Uruguayan embassy, and mathematicians around the world were doing this. And he was still being held in prison for a dozen years or so, and he had diabetes and he wasn't getting medicine and so on. So we put together a delegation from the U.S., Brazil, Mexico, and France, a mathematician from each of those places, to go down to Uruguay and see if we could do something to either get him out of prison or at least relieve the conditions. And we spent a week doing this, involving ourselves in various ways and going from prison to prison in Uruguay. Next slide. This is just a picture of a prison in Uruguay. Trying to find him. Well, we never found him, but our last day there, we talked to the general who was the equivalent of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And after we made our pitch about why this was a human rights violation, because he had been imprisoned for being a communist, and it wasn't even a crime to be a communist at that time, and he'd been a member of the parliament. So he wasn't in prison because of his mathematics. He was in prison because of his political activity. But after we went on with this, the Chief Justice said to us, well, we're very familiar with this very distinguished mathematician, and we're going to let him out of prison in 2 months. And I thought maybe this was due to my deficient Spanish, and I was misunderstanding. But no, in fact, that's true. He'd been in prison for 12 years, and he was released in 2 months. So I decided that there's something to this human rights business. Maybe you can actually make a difference. And so I got involved working with Amnesty International to see if I could do this on a more organized basis, perhaps. And one thing that I got involved with in Amnesty was the situation of Roma children in the Czech Republic. At the time that I got involved with this, there were segregated schools in the Czech Republic, and the Roma students were sent to one school, and the non-Roma students were sent to another. And we know a lot about what segregation does to people in the schools. So a report was done by Amnesty about this being a human rights violation. And several years later, the question was, had this improved? Well, yes, it had been improved in the sense that the segregated schools had been closed down. The schools had been integrated. But if you looked at the statistics, which I did, you found out that 80% of the Roma children were in schools that were specifically designed for people who were slow learners, to put it as politely as possible. In other words, they just automatically put the Roma students there without any kind of looking at what the actual data was. So after we presented those statistics, at least things improved a bit. Now, that was about 10 years ago. And I read an article in the New York Times just the other day about the situation of Roma children in the Czech Republic. So I was thinking we need to do another statistical study, see how bad it is, and see if we can get some correction, because if you don't keep at it, it seems to get worse. Another thing that I got involved in actually was a benefit to me, which frequently doesn't happen other than benefits to the general notion of human rights. When I got a retirement statement from American University, that is to say a statement is, here are your benefits if you put so much in your pension plan, and when you retire, this is what you will get back. So there were two columns in this showing that if you had so much money in your retirement account, here's what you would get every month. And there was the women's column, and then there was the men's column, which was 15% more than the women's column. Now, this was after we had a non-discrimination in employment law, which applied to American University, like everybody else, and the pension plan in any case was not run by the university. It was run by something called TIA-CREP, which ran pension plans for virtually every college and university in the country. So a lot of women were being affected by this. When I read this, I by that time had just finished law school, so I read it very carefully, and I called them up. I had not yet started law school when I first called them up. I called them up and said, you can't do this because it's illegal to discriminate on the basis of sex. And they said, no, we're discriminating on the basis of longevity. In other words, women live longer than men, and so they'll get more months of benefits, so we have to pay them less every month. And so I said, so that means that all of my male colleagues are going to die before I do, and I'm going to live longer? And they said, no, you don't understand statistics. Well, that was not one of their smarter moves, because I discovered that the Department of Labor was actually suing another university and the same pension plan and needed some help with the statistics. And one of the things that we did from the statistical point of view was show that men were killing themselves off. In other words, at that time in particular, men were more likely to drink, to smoke, to be shot, and to be killed in automobile accidents. In other words, it was the dangerous way of life that was causing much of the discrepancy in life expectancies between men and women. Not all of it, but a great deal of it. More than enough to account for the fact that they shouldn't be making this difference in pension benefits. So that was one argument. But then we had another argument, and you'll see there two normal curves, one that overlaps another. Why did we do that? Well, the law says similarly situated men and women have to be paid the same. And the argument of the insurance company and the universities was they're not similarly situated because the women are going to live longer than the men. So we did a study where we looked at 1,000 men and 1,000 women at age 65, which was sort of a normal retirement age. And of those 1,000 men and 1,000 women, a man might die the next day and a woman might die the next day. And a man might live 20 years and a woman might live 20 years. So you can match up this cohort of 1,000 people. 86% of them matched up, which left, of course, 14%. 7% of women who lived longer unmatched by men. That doesn't mean that they lived longer than all men, but there were more of them who were living longer. So 7% at that end of the distribution. 7% of men who died earlier unmatched by women. Not that they died before all women, but they were left over, in other words. But here we have 86% of the people who are similarly situated. So the argument that they're actually not similarly situated because of longevity doesn't apply to 86% of the people, and obviously you don't know who the people are going to be because we don't know when people are going to die. So that case eventually, a case that had the same kind of plan, went to the Supreme Court. By the time it got to the Supreme Court, I'd finished law school, which shows you how long it takes to finish law school, and had been out long enough to be a member of the Supreme Court bar so I could actually do the brief in the case. So it was another way to get involved in human rights using statistics. And the D.C. school closures is a sad case. It's a case where the statistics didn't help. One reason why they didn't help is because the people who were suing didn't use them. The claim when the D.C. schools were going to be closed last year, for the start of this year, is that the schools that were being closed were largely minority schools. Well, if you're in the District of Columbia and you start closing schools, it's very likely that a large number of them are going to be minority schools. So the question was, however, are you disproportionately closing the ones that are minority schools opposed to the ones that are not so minority? In other words, are you leaving all the schools open where we are, in the northwest quadrant of the city, and closing all the schools in southeast Washington? So there were a group of law students at UDC Law School who were organizing this, and they called me up about it, and they said, look, the schools that are being closed here, this one is 96% minority, this one's 86%, this one's 70%, et cetera, et cetera. So can you do expert testimony showing that they're disproportionately closing schools that are heavily minority? And I said, well, what about the schools that aren't being closed? And so there was a long silence on that. And I said, well, look, you can't prove anything about the closure of schools being disproportionately minority unless you know what's being left open. In other words, are there lots of minority schools which are being left open as well? Is there any statistical case for it? And moreover, the D.C. schools said we're closing schools that have low enrollment, and we're not closing schools that are overcrowded. And in fact, that's the case. However, when I told the people who were planning the suit, they decided that was too complicated to look at, and so they went ahead with the suit, and it lost. Now, as the case is, in my next time I taught a statistics class for which was an appropriate project, I had the students go out and look at this. Were they disproportionately closing minority schools? Were they closing schools that were low enrollment versus the high enrollment? And it turned out that what the D.C. schools were doing made sense, and you did not have a statistical case. So yes, a lot of minority schools were closed, but not disproportionately schools that were heavily minority. So, as I say, you can't always win, but it would have saved them the problem of filing the suit and a whole lot of effort had they looked at that in the first place. Now, getting out of here and back to other countries, so the next slide, one of the cases that I was involved in was in Rwanda. Some of you are too old to remember very well, but there was a genocide in Rwanda. About 800,000 people were killed, and it was largely Tutsi people who were killed as opposed to Hutu people who were doing the killing, largely, I say. But a lot of people, what happened in Rwanda is that from the east, from Tanzania, a group moved in and took over Rwanda and stopped the genocide that was occurring. And as they moved across the country of Rwanda, they arrested people who were responsible for the genocide insofar as they could, and they put them in prison. Well, as they moved across, more and more people were put in prisons. And in fact, they built additional prisons, getting funding from outside. And what was happening is they were constantly putting more people in prison, like another 10,000 every month, and nobody was getting out except by dying. So largely the people who were funding all of the prisons said, well, we've got to do something about this. It's a human right to have a fair trial. You can't just throw people in prison and throw the key away. Clearly a human rights issue. The genocide was a human rights issue, but it's also a human rights issue to throw the key away. So the Undersecretary for Human Rights in the U.S. State Department was somebody that I had served on the board of Amnesty International with. So he came up with the idea that we should start by taking a sample of the people who were in prisons and start the trials that way. Because there were 90,000 people in prison. This is a small country. You couldn't try all 90,000 of them at once, especially because a lot of the legal structure in Rwanda had been destroyed, both the buildings and the personnel who ran the courts. So the idea was we would take a sample. We needed to take what we call a stratified sample because the conditions under which people were imprisoned were different in the eastern part of the country than the western part of the country. So we stratified by taking a sample from some prisons in the east, some prisons in the west, and some from the prison in Kigali, which was the capital, and had different kinds of prisoners under different circumstances in the other places. So I went around from prison to prison, trying to find a list of the prisoners so that I could take a sample and put together this sample of people that then could be brought to trial. It was interesting going to the prisons because everybody thought I was going to look at the condition of the prisoners. Lots of human rights activists were, but it turned out that the people in the prisons were complaining that they were getting fat because they had too much food and no exercise. So it wasn't that we were looking at prison conditions, we were looking at the fact they couldn't get out of prison. So we came up with a sample of people then who, random samples stratified according to the parts of the country in which they were in prison. It was difficult because on many of the arrest warrants where it said crime, it simply said genocide. Didn't say whom they had killed, when, where. There was no arresting officer. All of the warrants had been signed by sort of a central office. Frequently only a name, either only a family name or only a given name was on the arrest warrant. So finding people from the prison records to put this sample together was difficult, but we were able at least to do something that made sense, so it looked as if there was some possibility of the people on the sample getting a fair trial. Unfortunately, the government of Rwanda didn't like the people that turned up to be on the sample. They would say, well, so-and-so, who really ought to be tried right away, isn't in your sample. And somebody else who should be tried right away is not in your sample. And, so we said, well, it's a random sample. It's, it's not your favorite prisoners. So that was another failed project. It was very unfortunate. Now, eventually, they got around to using a system in Rwanda where they used village courts as well as using a regular justice system, and they could eventually clear out the prisons. It took many years, but it did get done. The survey of the next slide. The survey of Syrian refugees is something that I actually did through the On-Call project with the AAAS. The American Bar Association wanted to do a survey of Syrian refugees. So the question is, how do you do this? How are you going to find the refugees that you're going to survey? Well, it's not easy. This was started several years ago. It's was not as bad then as it is now. But you had surveys, and then you had internally displaced people. And as to the people who were outside of Syria, a lot of them were in Jordan, or in Lebanon, or in Turkey. But others that were dispersed to the Gulf and to Europe and to other places. So the best you could do is decide that your population is going to be the Syrian refugees in Jordan and in Lebanon. So we managed to figure out a sampling scheme for that group of refugees so we could find out more about them, with the purpose of finding out what the extent was of human rights violations, as well as finding out from what part of the country people came, what they thought would be a solution. Did they want their homes back, or were they happy being gone, et cetera. So, unfortunately, it's a continuing problem. You can do another survey of Syrian refugees tomorrow, and then another survey the next day, because it's an ongoing problem. Okay, so the next slide. Okay, this one is just getting started, and it's a survey of the human rights situation in Sri Lanka that's being done by an organization, that's being organized by an organization. One of the problems in Syria is that we had no local statistician. We really needed a statistician to solve day-to-day surveying problems in Syria and in Lebanon. And the American Bar Association didn't think this was a good idea. I thought it was a great idea. But we didn't have a statistician on site. In Sri Lanka, there is a statistician on site. So while we still need to work some on the sampling plan and how to try to get information without endangering the population, we'll go forward with that. So it's not much is happening right now, but we hope to move forward. There's an organization called Statistics Without Borders. You all know, of course, about Physicians Without Borders. Well, Statistics Without Borders sends statisticians around to do similar sorts of things, or doesn't send them around but does stuff that you can do via email. So this is a project in India that we can do via email. There's a group that has an NGO agricultural project in India, and they need to have what we would call a design of experiments. In other words, a way to figure out which kinds of crops grow best, whether it's a good idea to do a crop rotation, whether having fields lie fallow makes sense. So all of the different things that go into improving agriculture, getting more from the land without having to have more labor, without having to have more equipment. A lot of statistics arose back in the end of the 19th century in England with crop rotation and different kinds of crops. So statistics have a history in agriculture. And I don't know much about agriculture. I've learned a little bit working on this project, but nonetheless, it's another project that needs statisticians, and they got the statisticians through Statistics Without Borders. Okay, the next one is my favorite one, because it's one that we're working on now. It's called Every Vote Counts. And what we're interested in is whether the voter ID laws keep people from voting. Well, yes, of course they keep people from voting, but to what extent, and is it disproportionately a certain kind of population? Last fall, we did what amounts to a pilot project in Northern Virginia. Northern Virginia had a statewide election last fall. And what we did was we did a sampling of precincts, because I was teaching sampling. I fortunately teach that every fall. And so the students in the sampling class designed a sample of precincts, and then students in our undergraduate class called Basic Statistics, which is very basic statistics, went to the precincts that we had picked for our sample and did an exit poll. And they basically just asked people if they had any trouble voting, and if so, if their trouble voting was connected with ID laws. And they found out that only a little less than 2% of the people who came to vote were unable to vote. And they were kind of disappointed. They were hoping it was a bigger problem. But then I pointed out to them that the Attorney General's race that year in Virginia was decided by a margin of 155 votes out of over 2 million. So they decided that every vote counts. So we're doing this project again. We're doing it locally in Northern Virginia, Montgomery and Prince George's County, and the district itself. We have students at George Mason also working with us to do mainly the part that's in Northern Virginia. But we also have people from North Carolina and Pennsylvania and Kansas and Texas doing similar sorts of projects with statistics classes there. So what we're looking at is we have a stratified sample of precincts, and we're looking at the income distribution of the precincts, so that we have some precincts that are largely low-income area and some precincts that are largely high-income areas. And we also record the people in the exit poll as to whether they're old or young, whether they're minority or not, whether they're male or female, so that we can see whether disproportionately certain people are affected by the voter ID laws. Now, when we did this last year, we found that indeed the low-income districts, people were more likely to have trouble, but we didn't do enough precincts to make it really statistically significant. But we're going to have a lot more precincts this fall, and we're doing it around in the other country. Okay, so I'm going to tell you one more thing very quickly, which is local also. This is a colleague of mine in the biology department. There's a big controversy about putting in a so-called purple line that will run in Montgomery County from over around Silver Spring over to Bethesda. Well, further than Silver Spring, but the part that's controversial is mainly between Silver Spring and Bethesda. And everything's been tried. We've leafleted, we've written about more traffic down Connecticut Avenue, which is already in bad shape, and more to this and more that, because the area around Connecticut Avenue is particularly crucial. So what people have thought of now is there's an endangered species in Rock Creek Park. And you see a picture. It's called Hayes Spring Amphipode, which, again, I don't know anything about, but my colleague in biology does. And it's an endangered species in Maryland. It's been found in Rock Creek Park, so the question is, can it be found along where the purple line is supposed to go? And if so, then the purple line can't go along there, and everybody's hoping then the purple line won't go anywhere. A golf course already got the purple line moved a little bit so it wouldn't bother their 14th hole. So we're hoping that the endangered species will be as effective as the 14th hole of the golf club. So that's what statistics and, in this case, biology can do in human rights.
Just a couple of questions, maybe, if there's questions for Dr. Gray?
Yeah.
When you did the India...
You need to speak loudly.
Okay. When you did the India agricultural study, did you do any study of whether the crops used were GMO or not GMO? Or anything?
No, we didn't, but there has been an extensive study done, and it was along the lines of people claiming that there was an increased suicide rate because of the GM crops. People's farms had been taken away from them, or they couldn't plant what they had previously planted, and so they were committing suicide. And it was true that the suicide rate was pretty high in the areas that were affected, but it turned out it was even higher in the rest of India. So we didn't look at GM crops, but somebody had looked at it as they were connected with suicide. That's the best I know about. There may be more. Yeah?
I'm not sure if I've got my facts accurate, but with Montesano, that just kind of reminded me of what they're doing with seeds, Montesano, and some of these other countries where they've patented seeds that actually don't reproduce. So if you planted what it produces will be a tomato, for example, without a seed in it. And they created in some of these other countries where the actual farmers can't produce their own crops. I can't remember if their lands got plowed out or if they're just economically it's not in their favor anymore. And the people have to continue, the catch is that people have to continue buying the seeds from Montesano because they can't go replant.
It's so far, I'm not an expert in agriculture, but so far as I know, that's not only in other countries, it's also the case in the United States, that you want people to continue to buy it, so you make it so that they can't get seeds from what they're reproducing. And I haven't worked on the problem, and I don't know what you could do other than showing that maybe people are very poor or commit suicide because of that. I don't know.
Well, let's hear from Jonathan Drake now, who's going to talk about a completely different area of science and technology. Jonathan is a senior program associate at AAAS, a colleague in the Scientific Responsibility, Human Rights and Law program, but he works in the Geospatial Technologies and Human Rights Project, which is another project in addition to the Science and Human Rights Coalition and the On-Call Scientist Project. He received his bachelor's degree in physics from Dickinson College and completed his master's degree at Arizona State University, where he mapped paraglacial geomorphology on Mars. And he's going to tell you a little bit about how that translates to human rights. He worked as a research assistant at the Space Telescope Science Institute and the Hawaii Institute for Geophysics and Planetology. And at AAAS, he's been involved in developing applications of imaging radar to problems relevant to human rights, as well as analyzing visible and near-infrared imagery in support of human rights projects. So, Jonathan?
Thank you, Theresa, and kudos for correctly pronouncing paraglacial geomorphology on the first try. All right, so as Theresa mentioned, at AAAS, I work in the Geospatial Technologies project. You've already heard Theresa introduce AAAS, so I'm not going to go over that there. I will mention that, as she mentioned, my background is in planetary science, and I sort of slid into this in perhaps a sort of unorthodox way. I was volunteering for a refugee resettlement organization while I was doing my master's in Arizona, and actually started thinking about how one might be able to use remote sensing to help out with those sorts of issues. Little did I know that shortly after graduating I would find an internship in DC, which would eventually turn into a job doing exactly that. So you never know how things are going to turn out in that way. So, at the Geospatial Technologies and Human Rights Project, is there a way to make this bigger? I can't even see my own slides here. We partner with human rights organizations we partner with human rights organizations who will provide us with the resources that they have on the ground. For example, contacts information about who did what to whom and where, we will use that to target satellite imagery of those areas and try to corroborate and quantify whether those reports are accurate to the extent that that can be determined. We work with a number of human rights groups from the very, very large well-known ones such as Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, all the way down to alphabet soup of very, very small, very locally focused NGOs. So they'll come to us with an issue that needs to be addressed. For example, a mass grave has been dug or a village has been burned. We will use that report, and that report can come in many different forms. Sometimes it comes with actual geodetic coordinates. Sometimes it's very, very vague and has been transcribed multiple different times, transliterated, and simply finding the area can be very, very difficult. Once we are able to identify the area, we then acquire the imagery, analyze it, and write a scientific report stating the findings without any advocacy component to it. The partner organization, however, will cite that report, and they are the ones who go do advocacy. As a scientific organization, we do not do advocacy. That's not our mandate. We do, however, lend them the scientific legitimacy to enable them to go do advocacy. So why should we use remote sensing for this? Well, it's very, very helpful in accessing remote areas. Those areas can be inaccessible either because of the physical security risks that are associated with it. They can also simply be too remote that it's, or so remote rather that it's impractical to send someone there. They can also cover large areas much, much more quickly than an on-the-ground team can. You can scroll through an image very, very quickly. There are historical archives that allow you to go back in time and see what happened, up to 30 years prior in the case of Landsat, back to 2000 in the case of the high-resolution imagery, which was only commercially available at that time. That allows you to establish a timeline of events, and it's considered a very objective form of reporting compared to, for example, eyewitness testimony, which can be considered, politically motivated. I really wish there was a way to change the view.
Swap displays.
Nope.
No, it's swapped it that way.
Oh, nope, that did not do it.
If you want to stand up so you can see it, I can.
Well, I can stand up and quickly. Yeah. Except then I don't have the microphone. I'll
Whatever's most comfortable, sorry.
I'll sit down. Okay, so things that we can. Yeah, this just does not work.
You can project your voice, we all can hear you.
I'm sorry. Oh, you can hear? Oh,
Yeah,
great. Okay. Thanks. Yeah. Okay. So examples of things that you can assess with satellites in a human rights context. You can assess the nature of conflict. Housing and infrastructure demolition. That's very, very easy. Houses are very easy to see at high-resolution satellite imagery. If the destruction is very, very widespread, we can even see that in some of the low-resolution Landsat type of satellite imagery, which is 30 meters per pixel. High resolution is generally considered 1 meter per pixel or below. The highest resolution that we can get is 50 centimeters per pixel, although that may be changing in the near future. The construction of infrastructure, for example, roads, bridges, that sort of thing. Monitoring development projects. Dams are often very interesting in a human rights context. Frequently they're built, especially in the developing world, with little regard to who may be living or subsisting on the resources that are going to be flooded, and we've done some projects with that. Natural resource extraction, open pit mining, for example. Deforestation, often a very, very critical issue for indigenous rights, particularly in the global south. Mapping property boundaries, mass graves, oil spills, etc. So I'll show you some nice picture examples of that. For example, here in Darfur, this is the village of Ngeha on January 13th, 2010. You can see there are a lot of little huts enclosed by what these are little fences that have been created using natural brush materials that have been gathered from nearby. However, by the 24th of December, that village has been pretty much wiped out. You can see several of these have survived, but the vast majority of them have simply been reduced to ashes. So that was a very, very clear example of what you can use for high-resolution imagery. And so we counted up all of those structures using some very basic assumptions about the occupancy of those structures, came up with a ballpark estimate of how many people would have been killed or displaced in that attack. In this case, it's 171 structures that had been destroyed. For more environmental monitoring, this is an area near the village of Bodo in Nigeria, in the Niger Delta, near Port Harcourt. So you can see this is a false color infrared image, so healthy vegetation appears bright red. Down here you can see a plantation of some sort, and this is actually the outskirts of the village here. Bodo was a major transshipment point for crude oil to a refinery owned by Royal Dutch Shell, and there was a very, very large oil spill there. And so you can see this is December 4th, 2006. By January 2009, all that bright red healthy vegetation has turned completely black, indicating that it has died. We followed up on that several 1 year later, and indeed you saw very, very little recovery. And also, incidentally, in the river itself, you can see that there's this rainbow sheen characteristic of an oil slick, and that is still present in 2011. In Sri Lanka, we were using high-resolution imagery to observe the final stages of the conflict between the Sri Lankan government and the Tamil Tigers. This is in an area that was considered to be a civilian safety zone. So you can see here in April 2009, there was very, very little construction in this area. However, by May 6th, very, very shortly thereafter, this entire zone, and this extended for miles and miles and miles, was extremely heavily populated. And what once had been a little sandy area with some trees had turned into a graveyard. Here, it's kind of hard to see in this image, but because they're on a beach, they couldn't actually dig pits. The water was right there, so you had to do the sorts of burials where you just sort of cover earth over top of the bodies, which was very useful for our purposes because each of those individual burials with the sand on top casts a shadow that we could use to actually count them. So within this area right here, we counted 195 burials on May 6th. By May 10th, that area had expanded substantially, far more than you would expect from simple natural deaths in that area. And then by May 24th, it had moved across the street, and the number of burials we estimated around 342. Another interesting thing about Sri Lanka that was very, very useful was because this was a sandy area, the near-surface airbursts of mortar impacts were extremely visible against the bright sand, and we could actually observe their morphology. They had this symmetry to them. This is from an Army field manual showing what those look like often. We were able to use that symmetry to compute the azimuths of the probable trajectory of the incoming projectile. And then when we applied that to all of the craters that we saw over here on the beach and extended them backwards, we searched along those vectors and were able to find here sites that we identified as probable mortar emplacements. You can see here they have the central mortar here surrounded by a sandbagged berm, alternating in a zigzag fashion, which again, when we consulted the Army field manual, was consistent with this lazy W formation. Cultural heritage destruction. There is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is considered a human right. So we've been looking a lot at, for example, what's been happening in Syria. There are many, many World Heritage sites in Syria. Many of them are at risk either from direct combat or looting, vandalism, that sort of thing. This is the Umayyad Mosque in Aleppo, and the Souk, which is one of the very, very largest medieval markets in the world. So you can see here in the before image, it's all intact. Afterwards, during the Syrian Civil War, the minaret, which you can see here casting a long shadow, has been completely destroyed. Also, the roof is caved in here. And I actually had the opportunity to check out this area just recently, and it has only gotten worse since then. Another interesting thing about Aleppo, so this is a study of the entire city, and each of these red dots indicates an incidence of damage that we had determined existed using the high-resolution satellite imagery. We overlaid that on top of a map of who controlled what neighborhoods that was provided to us by the U.S. government. And you can see here the vast majority of the damage occurred either in rebel-held or contested areas areas that were controlled by the regime, shown in pink here, were almost completely unscathed. Also, the Kurdish area, interestingly, had very, very little damage in it, but the rest of it was really getting hit very hard. We had a grant from the U.S. Institute of Peace to study border conflict as well, so we took a look at what was happening in Ukraine during the conflict there. There was certain actors were claiming that this was a spontaneous uprising that had little to do with any sort of state interests that was external to Ukraine. So we took a look at the harbor of Sevastopol here. Among many other things that we saw in that city, we saw that the breakwater here was being controlled by this tugboat that was towing a floating chain to a recently installed mooring buoy, which we thought was very interesting. And we could watch that as it opened and closed to allow certain ships in and certain ships out. After a little bit of Googling, we found that, in fact, as there are plane spotters and train spotters, there are also ship spotters, and they put their things up on the internet. So this is an ocean-going tug of the Russian Black Sea Fleet here. It's got a very distinctive superstructure with these two bright orange lifeboats, a green foredeck and a red afterdeck, which corresponds very, very well to what we can see here in this image here. There are the two lifeboats, green foredeck, red afterdeck. And it is, in fact, the vessel that we believe is controlling access to the bay. So with that, we thought there was a high priority that the Russian armed forces were indeed involved in this. There are definitely limits to what you can see with remote sensing, however, and I want to go over that because if you're going to be using this sort of evidence in any sort of international criminal tribunal, which is something that we're trying to do, we've done several trainings with various courts and commissions, and awareness of those limitations is critical. This is not a panacea, it is not omniscient, and that is something that needs to be understood. So the limitations include resolution, repeat cycle, dwell time, geometry, and atmospheric effects. So resolution. As I mentioned, the best resolution that we can get is 50 centimeters per pixel. Now, the commercial satellites that we use can actually image at slightly higher resolution than that. However, their licenses to sell the imagery from the Department of Commerce limit them to 50 centimeters. That may be changing in the near future, but as of right now, that's the best we can do. What that means, of course, is that a pixel in the image is 50 centimeters square on the ground. In absolutely optimal conditions, that is sufficient to distinguish maybe a person as one pixel if they're casting a long shadow. You certainly can't identify a person with it or read a license plate. So here's Tahrir Square in Egypt during the demonstrations. You can definitely identify tanks and APCs. You can identify the little makeshift shelters that were put up by the demonstrators. When demonstrators congregate in large groups, you can identify them. It sort of looks like black pepper sprinkled on the area. However, you can't identify individual people or follow them around. Repeat cycle. So these satellites. Where's the? Okay. While these satellites are numerous, they are all generally in the same orbital plane, which you can see here. And the reason for that is so that they can image at around 10 a.m. or 2 p.m. They do that in order to have the shadows not too long and not too short. If they're too short, everything looks very, very flat, and it can be very difficult to interpret. If they're too long, however, then those shadows start obscuring things. So you can see they're staggered here. There's one outlier, which is Eros B, that is in a slightly different plane. But the rest of these are just going around and around, staggered by several minutes. What that means is that if something is happening over here, you're not going to see it because it's not underneath the orbital path. It generally takes around 16 days for any one of these satellites to image an area a second time. Now, because there are multiple ones, you can get a little bit better temporal resolution by using imagery from multiple sensors. But nevertheless, this is an awful lot of the area of the world's area on either side of this that's not covered at any given time. And if something's happening during that time, then you're not going to get an image of it. Also, related to that, you notice how quickly those satellites were going around. Obviously, that's sped up about 1,000 times, but they're not hovering over a specific area. These are in low orbits, not geostationary orbits. Geostationary orbits that sync with the Earth's rotation are very, very far away and are useless for providing imagery of anything except hemisphere-sized weather systems. Low Earth orbit satellites that get the high resolution are over a particular spot for seconds. It used to be that I would say that we could only get still images. There was no such thing as high-resolution video from space. That has recently changed with a company called Skybox, rather, that is, it is sort of Skybox, but it's Skybox, that is providing short duration, high resolution video from space. It's all in black and white, and as you can see here, it does not last very long. They have to actually physically roll the spacecraft as it passes over to maintain their frame. This is Dubai. You can see Burj Khalifa here, and you can watch the parallax as it flies over. You can see the traffic moving. There was a plane that flew by down here at the beginning of the video. And there goes its shadow. And they're going to stop down the sensor because they're looking through more and more air as they fly over. There it goes. And that's it. That's what you can get. So you can look at an area, it could tell you something, for example, whether the roads are closed or not. But it's definitely not the sort of enemy of the state. He's going into this building, he's coming out of that mountain, that Hollywood may have you believe is possible. They're also limited by geometry. Most of the perspective that these images have is top-down. And the reason for that is so that you can actually see as much of the area as possible that's not obscured by other buildings, particularly when there's really buildings, mountains, that sort of thing. However, that can also be difficult when you're evaluating damage. Here, for example, you can see that there's been damage to the facade of this building. This is in Aleppo in Syria. It's essentially been burned out. When you're looking at a high off-nadir angle like this, you can see the side of the building and determine that it has been damaged. However, this is rare. Most images do not have an off-nadir angle like this because they have to roll the spacecraft over to obtain it. Most of the images look like this, and if you were an analyst, you were looking at that, you would say this building looks just fine. High off-nadir angles can be useful to see the sides of things. However, you're also obscuring anything that's hidden back here, so it's a trade-off. The other issue with high off-nadir angles is you're looking through more atmosphere. So this is Mogadishu in Somalia. From a straight-down perspective, you can see these foundations here, buildings that have been abandoned for quite some time. Here's the same image looking obliquely, so you can actually see the fronts of these buildings here, which are completely invisible from the top-down perspective. However, because you're looking at such a greater slant distance through the atmosphere, everything is much, much blurrier and more difficult to interpret. All of this means that remote sensing is powerful, but not omniscient. It's not a panacea. You're still limited to mostly still images. The video that you can get is black and white. It does not last for very long. The enhanced function that you may have seen in many, many movies doesn't work that way. And generally what that means is that when Will Smith is looking out of his car window, the spy satellite's looking at him. It does not happen. The importance of independent and peer-reviewed analysis is very important. Even experienced analysts make mistakes, and I'm going to show you some that we've made because it's something that we think is important to admit, as well as being enlightening. So this is Tripoli Street in Misrata, Libya here. This is after the conflict began. These scars here were not present before. This is a sand roadblock that's been rolled over and demolished by some sort of heavy vehicle. There are craters on the street and black scorch marks from vehicle fires. Now, when we saw this is the after image. The before image looks just fine. We also noticed that there were these large green features here that were not present in the earlier image, and that had dimensions that were very, very similar to T-55 and T-72 tanks, which the Gaddafi regime was known to have purchased. And so we thought, okay, there's a lot of damage here. We've got these sudden green vehicles on the sides of the road on this side street. This must be, the army rolling through. However, when we looked in the infrared band, they turned red, just like healthy vegetation does. These are ornamental trees that were not in leaf in the before image and had since blossomed. And so when you see that in the false color, it became very, very obvious that, in fact, these weren't tanks. There were tanks present, and there is, in fact, a tank in this image, but that's not what it was. Can anyone see the tank?
Is it the upper right?
Yeah, right there?
Yeah.
Yep, that's it. And when you look in the near-infrared versus the visible bands, you can see it doesn't change color. That's a nice thing about the infrared bands. A lot of the camouflages that various vehicles will use They have a spectral response that's similar to vegetation in the human eye's wavelengths, but it does not work in the infrared. So if you look at the infrared, you can just see it starts standing right out. Here in the outskirts of Aleppo, we saw an area that had been very, very pockmarked by these craters that we initially thought were shell craters. They had the area was reported to have been bombarded very, very heavily. However, you'll notice that these down here in particular are very, very regular. These are a little bit more irregular. Shell craters don't generally appear in very, very regular patterns like that. And indeed, when we looked at the historical analysis, you could see that beforehand, these had all been occupied by trees in an orchard that had been pulled up with a tractor and left big root rolls. And when we got several more images, we could see, in fact, here are the tracks that the tractor had left when they pulled them up, presumably with a chain. So, those are just some examples of what we can do and some of the limitations of what satellite imagery is capable of. If you have any questions, yeah.
You said that they can only sell a certain, like the pixels, like they're only allowed to sell like a certain resolution of pixels.
Yeah.
Is that illegal? And if so, like why?
Yeah, and that is a limitation that's imposed by the U.S. government. When in the early 2000s, when these companies decided that they wanted to sell satellite imagery, the U.S. government, presumably for security reasons, said that they can only sell imagery up to 50 centimeters per pixel. You can get 50 centimeter per pixel imagery of anywhere in the world through U.S. vendors, with the exception of Israel. Israeli satellite imagery of Israel from U.S. companies has to be degraded to about, I think, 1.2 meters per pixel, which makes it much more difficult to analyze. Because of that, we did a study, for example, of the conflict with Hezbollah, between Hezbollah and Israel in 2006. And we were only able to document damage to the Lebanese side. We were not able to do it to the Israeli side because of that limitation. That unfortunately led some people to claim that we were being biased against the Israelis, but it was simply due to the availability of imagery.
Other questions? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
I'm not sure if you said it, but what's the highest resolution these satellites can potentially take?
So the commercial satellites we know they're capable of 40 centimeters per pixel. Now, what the difference that extra 10 centimeters makes, you'd have to ask the U.S. government, why they think that is. I can speculate. It is only speculation, but I mentioned that at 50 centimeters per pixel, it's very, very difficult to identify a single human being unless the optical situation with cast shadows is really just perfect. It may be that at 40 centimeters per pixel that becomes much more easy to identify, but that's just a guess.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you both. Sue.
So this question is for the whole panel, given that most of the audience would-be lawyers. How has your research sort of, and I think Mary mentioned it a couple of times, but just if you could elaborate on how this research bolsters legal arguments as well as litigation, and if you can think of instances, because I'm thinking, I'm not a scientist and I'm not a lawyer, I'm a political scientist, and that doesn't constitute any one of those two things. But it's interesting to see how this work and this kind of evidence can maybe strengthen a legal case or a legal precedent. So if any one of you can talk about, and you, Theresa, as well.
Many of the slides in this presentation are actually adapted from a presentation that my colleague and I have given to a number of international human rights courts and commissions that we're trying to educate them about the capabilities of this research and its usefulness in courts. Let's see, last October we gave a presentation very similar to this one to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, as well as going into a little bit more with a lawyer that we had on staff about some of the legal precedents. There are rather few of them at this point. They're it's still something of an emerging technology in terms of its use in the legal field, but we're trying to change that. We also recently returned from Rwanda, where we were giving that presentation to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and they seemed very, very interested in it, and we're working on following up with them on that. As of right now, my understanding is that and I'm speaking as someone who is very much not a lawyer, but that it is something that has begun to be used, but that its full potential has yet to be completely exploited.
I've seen it most with the on-call scientist requests. The requests we get from attorneys are in 3 areas. One is assistance from medical and psychological experts to do evaluations of asylum seekers, to document torture and trauma. We've seen it in, as I said, with the Innocence Project, so wrongful convictions, reviewing evidence, looking for new evidence that might be available. And then in other cases, the primary request we've had is for environmental scientists. That seems to be where human rights lawyers who are working on environmental rights, it's kind of obvious that, well, you need an environmental scientist to document things, or an engineer to document if there was a failure in the design of a dam or a oil pipeline or something like that. So we haven't seen as much some of the potential uses of, say, social scientists to document things, or statisticians, or other types of requests in legal cases. We haven't seen that as much, but again, it's growing, the recognition of the application of these kinds of things. You see, for example, amicus briefs in some of the cases related to juvenile life without parole, solitary confinement. There are amicus briefs by psychologists, neuroscientists that have been very influential. So lawyers are starting to see that there's more happening in the scientific research areas that are very helpful to their cases.
The one thing that I'd like to emphasize is to get the statistician or any expert on the case early, because I get too many phone calls the day before they're ready to go to trial, and that's too late. One example of that, a number of years ago in Montgomery County, was a case that involved SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. And the state had a pediatrician serving as an expert on statistics, and it was a huge, huge mess. And it needed somebody who was a statistician to work for the defense to straighten it out, so to speak. And there were important cases in England where the same thing happened. A more recent one is the issue of the juvenile life sentences and the death penalty that for people who are mentally disabled. And the most recent one was the decision that a cutoff of 70 as a determination was inadequate. And I'm organizing a session on statistics in the Supreme Court for a statistics conference that's coming up. And one of the people is talking about measurement errors in cases like that. And comes up all the time. Another person is going to talk in the same session about how the Walmart case, where the class certification case lost, that had they done the statistics better, the case wouldn't have lost, according to the people who worked on it.
So I think there's a class that's going to come in here in just a minute. So I wanted to let you know for next steps, there's a couple of flyers up here with contact information, our website. There's a sign-up sheet. We have a monthly newsletter with new events and new information about science and human rights. So if you're interested, please sign up and give us an email, give us a call.
Or email me.
Oh, and thank you for doing the evaluations. This is all part of our scientific approach to human rights. We need to evaluate everything. So thank you for finishing that and giving it to Oliver Moles over here, who is a member of the working group and is a social psychologist, if you want to know about that.
Thank you. I'm sorry we're at the crashing end.
No, I know. I can hear.
And they start at 1:30. So
yeah.
Thank you so much.